We had been driving for several hours when the forest started to thicken, obscuring the sky. The road became narrower and more winding until our old Jeep finally stopped at the edge of a small clearing. Tom, Lisa, and I had decided to spend the weekend away from the city hustle, far from worries and problems, in one of the country's densest forests. Stepping out of the car, I inhaled the cool, fresh air filled with the scents of pine and damp earth. Birds chirped in the tree canopies, and somewhere in the distance a stream gurgled. Here, far from civilization, everything felt different, somehow primordial and wild. Tom, our driver and avid nature lover, was already pulling our backpacks and tent out of the trunk. His short blonde hair gleamed in the sun, and a satisfied smile played on his face. Lisa, with her long dark hair and a camera in hand, was trying to capture every moment of our journey. Her enthusiasm was contagious, and I felt excitement beginning to take hold of me. We started our hike, venturing deeper into the forest. The path underfoot seemed barely trodden, adding to its mystery. Leaves rustled underfoot, and sunlight pierced through the tree canopies in rare golden rays. The forest around us was so dense that it felt like we were stepping into another world, separated from reality. As we progressed, Tom told us stories about this forest, its wildlife, and the rare animals that lived here. Lisa, in turn, took pictures and asked questions, intrigued by every bush and tree. I walked behind, savoring the moment and feeling the city's hustle slowly dissolve into this green ocean. Time passed unnoticed, and when we finally reached the place where we planned to set up camp, the sun was already setting. We stopped at a small clearing surrounded by tall pines and began setting up the tent. Lisa started a fire while I pulled out food and utensils from my backpack. Nightfall in the forest came quickly. The sounds of nature became more distinct, and the forest filled with nocturnal life. We sat by the campfire, enjoying its warmth and coziness, when Lisa suggested we tell each other scary stories. In the dark, among the shadows and rustlings of the forest, the idea seemed especially appealing. Tom started first. His voice was deep and ominous, telling of an old abandoned house supposedly haunted by ghosts. We listened, holding our breath, when we suddenly heard a strange noise coming from the forest. The noise was quiet, almost imperceptible, but clearly different from the usual sounds of the night forest. We exchanged glances, and anxiety began to slowly fill our hearts. Tom, still holding the flashlight, stood up and suggested we check out what it could be. Reluctantly but driven by curiosity, we followed him. Our flashlights illuminated our path, dispelling the darkness but not calming our fear. We walked through the forest, and it seemed like the trees were closing in around us, their branches whispering something unintelligible and shadows dancing, resembling bizarre figures. Occasionally, we heard some sounds, the crunch of branches underfoot, a distant howl resembling a cry. Every step felt perilous, and we felt the tension rising. Suddenly, through the dense thicket, we saw a faint light. We pointed our flashlights in that direction, and after walking a bit further, we came to a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing stood an old cabin. It was small and clearly abandoned, with peeling paint on the walls and a sagging roof. The windows were dark and looked like empty eye sockets staring straight at us. The half-open door creaked in the wind, emitting a sinister sound. The cabin looked like no one had been here for many years. The roof had caved in places, shrubs entwined the walls, and the grass around it was tall and thick. The windows, covered in dust and cobwebs, let in no light. The dim moonlight only added to the mystical and eerie atmosphere of this place. We stood before the cabin, examining it, and our fears slowly gave way to curiosity. Something about this place drew us in, and we couldn't just leave. Tom, the first to overcome his fears, headed towards the door, and holding our breath, we followed him. We approached slowly and cautiously, the flashlight beams trembling in our hands. When we got close enough, we noticed that the door handle was unusual. It was massive, made of dark, polished metal, with intricate patterns resembling ancient symbols. The handle looked like it belonged to another time, some distant and mysterious past. Tom carefully touched the handle, and we all held our breath. With a slight creak, the door yielded and began to open. We stood tense, ready for anything. But what we saw inside shook us to our core. Beyond the threshold was not the dark and dusty interior we expected to see. Instead, a huge, luxurious mansion stretched before us. High ceilings were adorned with magnificent chandeliers sparkling with crystals. The walls were covered in rich fabric and decorated with paintings in golden frames. Marble floors gleamed in the light of numerous lamps, and at the far end of the spacious hall, a grand staircase led to the second floor. We stood in astonishment, unable to believe our eyes. I turned to look at the house from the outside. Through the open door, I saw the same small, dilapidated cabin standing in the middle of the forest. Inside, however, we were surrounded by luxury, as if we had entered another world, another reality. "How is this possible?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling with excitement and fear. Tom looked like he was trying to find a logical explanation for what was happening, but clearly couldn't. I felt fear and curiosity battling within me. This place beckoned us, calling us to explore its mysteries. "What do you think? Should we look around?" Tom asked uncertainly. We exchanged glances, and although we were scared, we decided to enter. The floor underfoot was cool and smooth, and the air inside the mansion felt heavy and old. We cautiously explored the mansion, marveling at its grandeur, while simultaneously feeling a growing sense of dread. The first thing we noticed was the mirrors. They hung in every room, large and small, and seemed to reflect not only our images, but something strange, hidden deep within. Sometimes, as I passed another mirror, I caught glimpses of shadows that disappeared as soon as I turned. This added to the mystery and anxiety. We walked through the luxurious hall and found ourselves in a spacious living room decorated with antique furniture. Tall windows were draped with heavy velvet curtains, and soft carpets with intricate patterns lay on the floor. An enormous fireplace, covered in carvings, occupied almost an entire wall. Shelves were lined with antique books and strange, exotic figurines. As we examined the room, things started to seem increasingly odd. The books on the shelves appeared too new for such an old house. They were in perfect condition, as if they had never been opened. In one corner stood an antique gramophone, which suddenly began to play by itself, emitting a quiet, melodic, yet eerie tune. We approached and saw that the record wasn't spinning. We moved from room to room, and the oddities continued to follow us. In one of the bedrooms, wardrobe doors started to open and close on their own, as if someone invisible was trying to get out. In the dining room, set for a feast, the food looked fresh, but there was no sign of anyone who might have prepared it. The air was filled with a faint scent of roses mixed with something more musty and unpleasant. Every new step through the house filled us with a sense of an unseen presence, some malevolent spirit inhabiting this place. We felt a cold emanating from the walls, penetrating straight to our bones. Our hearts beat faster, and we were no longer sure if we should continue exploring. Suddenly we heard a cry for help. It was faint but distinct, as if someone was shouting from far away, making it hard to determine where the sound was coming from. We froze, listening to the voice echoing through the mansion's walls. Fear and anxiety overwhelmed us. "Did you hear that?" whispered Lisa, her eyes wide with horror. Tom nodded, trying to pinpoint the direction of the voice. "It sounded ghostly," he muttered, looking around. We stood in the living room, unsure of where to go. The voice seemed to come closer and then farther away, as if playing with us, luring us deeper into the sinister house. The shadows on the walls seemed alive, and it felt like something terrifying was lurking in every corner. Suddenly, the lights in the house went out. Complete darkness enveloped us, and at that moment, the house filled with a terrible, piercing roar that made us freeze in place. Lisa screamed in fear, and Tom gasped. "Run!" I shouted, and we all dashed towards the exit. The darkness and the roar consumed us as we frantically tried to find our way back through the now endless and confusing corridors and rooms. As we ran past the mirrors, I noticed strange silhouettes. In the reflections, I saw the figure of a wolf, or rather, a man turned into a wolf. His eyes glowed in the dim light, filled with rage and malevolent power. It was a werewolf. Each time we passed another mirror, the image of the werewolf became more distinct. His powerful body, covered in thick, dark fur, and the fierce expression on his face were terrifying. In the mirrors, he moved with us like a sinister shadow, pursuing us closely. His claws were long and sharp, and his mouth was full of dagger-like teeth, ready to tear us apart at any moment. In panic, we ran down the stairs. For some reason, I decided to look back and saw in the moonlight streaming through the window a shadow rapidly approaching us. It was the werewolf. His eyes burned with wild fury, and his mouth was slightly open, revealing sharp knife-like teeth. He let out a growl that made our blood run cold. "Faster!" Tom shouted, and we ran on, trying to escape the monster. The werewolf lunged after us, his claws scraping against the wooden steps, creating a sound that made our hair stand on end. We ran without looking back, feeling his breath on our necks. Our hearts pounded in a frantic rhythm, and fear drove us forward. We rushed towards the exit, feeling the werewolf almost catching up to us. Tom was the first to reach the door and flung it open with force. But instead of the saving forest, we saw another room beyond the door. Our hearts sank in horror. In front of us was not a moonlit clearing, but a dark, neglected hut. We exchanged glances, realizing there was no way out. The werewolf was too close, and we had no choice but to enter. We dashed into the hut and quickly slammed the door behind us, locking it with a heavy bolt. The noise and roar of the werewolf ceased as if we had entered another place. Breathing a sigh of relief, we looked around. The hut was small and abandoned. Through broken windows, faint moonlight streamed in, casting long shadows on the floor. The old, dust-covered wooden walls creaked in the wind. The ceiling was low and blackened from time and moisture. In the corners stood old, half-ruined cupboards, with torn books and broken items peeking out. On the floor lay a dirty, worn-out rug, torn and faded in places. In the center of the room stood a wooden table with 3 chairs, one of which was overturned. Empty bottles and candle holders, long devoid of candles, were scattered on the table. In one corner was an old stove that hadn't seen a fire in ages. A musty smell emanated from it, filling the room with a sense of abandonment and hopelessness. Suddenly, the silence seemed threatening. We stood, trying to catch our breath and figure out what to do next. Our hearts still pounded from the recent fear and running. Lisa sat on one of the chairs, her hands trembling and her eyes full of horror. Tom looked around, trying to find any exit or clue on where to go. "What is this place?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Tom replied, rummaging through the cupboards and looking behind corners. "But we need to be careful. Something is definitely wrong here." We continued examining the hut when Tom found some old photographs on the wall. One particularly caught his attention. It showed a boy and his mother. I stepped closer and took the photograph in my hands. As I looked at it, something strange and horrifying happened. Before my eyes, the photograph came to life. The boy and the woman on it began to age rapidly, their skin wrinkling and thinning until it turned to ash. Their faces contorted in agony, and they started screaming for help. Their cries were piercing and heart-wrenching. I screamed in horror and dropped the photograph. "What happened?" Lisa asked fearfully, running over to me. I, trembling, pointed at the photograph lying on the floor. Tom picked it up and we all looked at the picture. Now the photograph depicted skeletons standing in the same pose as the boy and his mother before. Their empty eye sockets seemed bottomless and cold. We looked at each other in fear, not knowing what to do next. Our hearts pounded in our chests, and the fear became almost palpable. "Something is definitely wrong here," Tom whispered, his voice shaking. We decided to keep exploring, hoping to find some clue. In one of the cupboards, we found an old scrap of a letter. Written in a shaky hand were the words, "Soon my experiment will be over, and I will save you, Mom." As we read this, strange sounds started emanating in the room. The windows were boarded up, and the moonlight barely seeped through the cracks. The sounds came from the corners of the room, a quiet, insistent whisper, as if someone was trying to tell us something. The whisper grew louder and clearer, creating a creepy feeling that we were not alone in this place. We stood frozen, listening to these whispers, feeling cold shivers running down our spines. It felt like the walls of the hut were closing in, and the shadows around us were growing thicker and more alive. The fear we felt was all-consuming, and it seemed like time had stopped. "We need to get out of here," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. I also thought we needed to leave. The only exit we saw was through the same door we entered, but the werewolf could be out there. I approached the door and listened, trying to catch any sound, but it was quiet outside. My heart pounded in my chest and I felt the tension rising with each passing second. "We need to try," I whispered, turning to my friends. "We have no other choice." I slowly and cautiously took hold of the door handle, trying not to make a sound. Then, taking a deep breath, I quietly opened the door and peeked inside. Before us was a new room. It was an old library. Inside the library was dim light, interrupted only by the faint glow seeping through the boarded-up windows. The dusty, musty atmosphere was filled with the scent of old books and wood rot. Tall, wooden shelves filled with books reached the ceiling, forming a labyrinth of books and manuscripts. On some shelves lay stacks of yellowed documents and scrolls, tied with faded ribbons. In the center of the room stood a large oak table covered in a layer of dust. Scattered papers, old quills, and inkwells lay on the table. In one corner stood an old globe covered in cobwebs. The flat lamps hanging from the ceiling had long stopped glowing, adding even more gloom to the library. In the corners of the room were old armchairs and reading tables upholstered in cracked leather. On the walls hung portraits of people in heavy, gilded frames. The faces in the portraits were stern and wary, their gazes seeming to follow us wherever we went. We slowly entered the library, our footsteps echoing dully in the room's silence. The air was filled with a faint, barely perceptible whisper, as if the old books themselves were telling their stories. "This place feels like it's from another era," whispered Lisa, her voice trembling with excitement and fear. I approached one of the shelves and my gaze fell upon a book with a black cover. The cover was adorned with sinister symbols and intricate patterns. I carefully took the book and opened it. On the first page it read Necromancy Handbook. I began to flip through the pages, and with each turn the sense of dread only intensified. The pages of the book depicted horrifying rituals and described spells for raising the dead, summoning spirits, and communicating with dark forces. Drawings of ritual circles, pentagrams, and terrifying creatures made my blood run cold. I felt cold sweat break out on my forehead, and my hands began to tremble. I closed the book and looked around. Many other books on the shelves were also related to dark arts. The titles on the spines spoke of demonology, alchemy, black magic, and other grim subjects. The very atmosphere of the library seemed to be steeped in sinister energy, and each new discovery only heightened our unease. "Everything here is related to black magic," I whispered to my friends. "We need to be very careful." We started walking around the library, trying to find any way out. Every shelf, every corner was filled with strange and frightening books. We were looking for a secret door or some passage, but found nothing. The feeling of hopelessness and fear grew stronger. We continued examining the library when suddenly we heard Lisa's frightened voice. "Guys, come here!" Her voice trembled, and she was pointing at a book lying on the table. I approached and read the title on the cover. 3 Uninvited Guests Doomed to Die. We exchanged glances, and fear reflected in our eyes. Tom took the book and opened it, and we began to read. To our horror, the book described our adventure, how we arrived in the forest, found this house, and started exploring it. "This is impossible," Tom whispered, his voice shaking. We kept reading, and our fears only grew. The book described another person who had been watching us all this time. Reading this, we nervously looked around, trying to find who could be observing us. But we saw no one. "What the hell is going on here?" Lisa whispered nervously. We continued reading and reached the part where it described us standing in the library. To our horror, new entries began to appear before our eyes. They said that while we were reading, a werewolf was sneaking up on us from around the corner. "No, this can't be true," Tom exclaimed, his face pale. Our hearts were pounding and panic began to overtake us. We slowly turned around and saw a shadow approaching us from around the corner. It was the werewolf, and his eyes gleamed with malice and fury. "Run!" I shouted, and we all dashed towards the exit. We ran, stumbling and bumping into shelves, books falling to the floor, scattering pages everywhere. The sounds of our footsteps and the clatter of falling books echoed through the library. We didn't look back, knowing the werewolf was chasing us, his growls and heavy breathing getting closer. We ran, feeling panic gripping us more with each second. The sounds of our footsteps echoed loudly in the library, mingling with the crash of falling books. The werewolf's heavy breathing and growls were getting closer, like the shadow of death pursuing us. Ahead, in the dim light of our flashlights, we saw a door. It was our only chance for salvation. "Faster this way!" Tom shouted, and we, without slowing down, headed for the door. Reaching it, I pushed it open with all my might, and it creaked as it swung open. We burst inside, nearly falling over each other, and immediately slammed the door shut behind us. As soon as the door closed, the noise stopped as if we had teleported to another place. Inside, we looked around and saw that we had entered a laboratory. The room was dimly lit by several flickering lamps, creating a creepy atmosphere. Old laboratory tables covered in layers of dust and scattered instruments stood everywhere. Glass flasks, test tubes, and retorts filled with colorful liquids were on shelves and tables, as if waiting to be used again. The walls were lined with shelves of books and manuscripts, most of which were covered in mysterious symbols and formulas. In the corner of the room stood a large metal table with straps for restraint, reminiscent of an operating table. Lamps hung above it, casting a dim light. The air was filled with a sharp smell of chemicals and something rotten. On one of the tables, we noticed an old microscope and numerous scattered notes. In the center of the laboratory stood a massive wooden table with ancient books on it, one of which was open, its pages covered with ancient spells and drawings. "What is this place?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling with fear and confusion. We continued to explore the laboratory, trying to find any clue about what was happening here. On one of the tables, we noticed an old, worn-out diary. The cover was frayed, and the pages had yellowed with age. We opened it and began reading the entries made in a shaky hand. Asterisk. Asterisk. First entry. My research on resurrecting dead animals continues. Today I tried to bring a wolf back to life, but all my efforts were in vain. All known methods yielded no results. The wolf remained dead despite all my efforts. Asterisk, asterisk, second entry. In desperation, I turned to a man known in certain circles as a master of black magic. His knowledge and methods were dangerous and forbidden, but I had no choice. He suggested incorporating elements of black magic into my experiments. Asterisk. Asterisk. Third entry. The result was astounding. Today, I was able to resurrect the wolf using the spells and rituals suggested by this man. The wolf came back to life and lived for half an hour before dying again. This was an incredible success, but also a challenge. I realized that I was now on the verge of a discovery that could change everything. Asterisk, asterisk, fourth entry. I continued my experiments, trying to understand how to prolong the life of the resurrected creature. Each time I used increasingly complex spells and rituals, added new components, and altered methods. The results were unpredictable, but progress was undeniable. The wolf lived longer, but something in its eyes frightened me. They became inhuman, full of rage and malice. We didn't learn what happened next, as the entries ended at the most intriguing moment. "This is horrible," Lisa whispered, her voice shaking. "We need to be very careful," Tom added. "We don't know what else might be hiding here." Just as he said this, we heard a noise coming from the far end of the laboratory. Our hearts started pounding again, and I thought, what now? We watched the darkness warily, ready for anything. Suddenly, a man emerged from the shadows. He looked exhausted and haggard, with dark circles under his eyes and disheveled hair. He wore old, worn-out clothes that had clearly seen better days. His face was covered in stubble, and his eyes expressed a mix of fatigue and despair. He slowly raised his hands, showing he meant no harm. "Please, don't be afraid," he said in a quiet, calming voice. "I'm not dangerous." We stood warily, watching his every move. He approached, but stopped at a safe distance, understanding our mistrust. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "My name is Edgar," he replied. "Like you, I stumbled upon this place and couldn't find a way out. I've been here for a long time trying to escape, but this house, it won't let me." Edgar began to tell his story, and with each word we felt more of the horror he had experienced. "Several months ago, I came to this forest to study the local flora. I'm a biologist and have always loved exploring nature. One day, I stumbled upon this house. At first, it seemed like an ordinary abandoned building, but inside, I found something incredible. I couldn't resist the temptation to explore it, and that was my mistake." Edgar sighed heavily and continued, "As soon as I entered, the house seemed to come alive. The doors and corridors began to change. I tried to leave, but each time I ended up in a new room. At first, I found this laboratory and realized that strange experiments were conducted here. I read the diaries of a scientist who tried to resurrect the dead. His experiments got out of control, and now the house is filled with dark magic and ghosts." We listened to him, holding our breath, realizing that Edgar had fallen into the same trap as us. "I tried to find a way out," he continued, "but every time the house brought me back. The only thing I've learned is to be careful. Everything here can be dangerous. And now you're here. Maybe together we have a chance to escape." Edgar seemed sincere, and his story sounded plausible. We exchanged glances, realizing that we now had an ally in this nightmare. Perhaps together we could find a way out of this sinister house. I asked Edgar if he had any ideas on how to get out of here. He shook his head, his face thoughtful and sad. "Honestly, I don't know," he replied. "But there's one more door I haven't had a chance to explore. I recently found this laboratory and didn't have time to check everything around." We were surprised to hear this. "What door?" Tom asked. Edgar gestured for us to follow him. We walked through the laboratory to a far wall where, behind an old cabinet almost hidden from view, there indeed was a door. It was old and massive with a rusty iron lock. "Here," he said, pointing to it. "I haven't had a chance to explore it. Maybe it leads somewhere outside." Our hearts pounded with hope. Tom approached the door and, with effort, opened it. Behind the door we saw a narrow passage leading down. We turned on our flashlights and began descending the old, creaky stairs. With each step, the darkness grew thicker and the air grew colder. The stairs seemed endless, and each step emitted an ominous creak. We moved cautiously, lighting our way with flashlights until we reached the bottom. Before us opened a basement that looked like an ancient temple. The room was enormous, with rough stone walls and ceiling covered in old, darkened frescoes and symbols. In the center of the room stood a massive altar, surrounded by stone columns engraved with mysterious signs and images. Ritual circles and pentagrams were drawn on the floor, some glowing with a dim, sinister light. In the corners of the room stood tall statues depicting ancient gods or demons, their eyes seeming alive and following our every move. The air was filled with the smell of dampness and something ancient, as if we were in a place long forgotten by people. We began to explore this ancient underground room, examining the symbols and old objects. Soon, our attention was drawn to 5 cubes scattered in a circle. They were made of dark stone, covered with strange inscriptions and symbols, barely visible in the dim flashlight light. "What could they be for?" Lisa asked, examining one of the cubes. Tom thoughtfully looked around. "Maybe it's part of some ritual," he suggested. "What if they need to be gathered and placed in the pentagram?" Edgar proposed, pointing to the glowing signs on the floor. I immediately disliked the idea. Something about it seemed wrong and dangerous. But my friends were determined. "Let's try it," Lisa said, addressing Tom and Edgar. "Maybe it will help us understand what's going on." I stood aside, watching them prepare to execute the plan. Each cube had inscriptions that seemed to indicate its place in the ritual circle. They began deciphering the inscriptions, trying to figure out which cube went where. While they were busy, I decided to open the book I'd kept with me all this time. It was the same book that described our adventures. I sat on a stone ledge and began to read. The pages turned by themselves, as if the book was guiding me to the right section. I read the book while my friends arranged the cubes in the pentagram. The book described all our actions, and I was horrified to realize that every move we made was predicted. Suddenly, among the lines, I noticed something new. A description of a werewolf sneaking down the stairs to the underground sanctuary. He was desperate, and bitter memories of the past flashed through his mind. His name was Marcus, and he was his mother's only son. He loved her more than anything. She was his world, his support, and inspiration. But one day, in a fateful moment, she died under mysterious circumstances. Marcus swore to himself that he would do everything possible to bring her back. Years passed, filled with study and research. He studied sciences, alchemy, anything that could help him achieve his goal. But nothing worked. In desperation, he met a man who offered him the path of dark magic. This man, Edgar, claimed to have the knowledge and power to bring the dead back to life. With his help, Marcus's research progressed. He saw progress, but his suspicions grew as well. Edgar increasingly reminded him of a tool of dark forces, and one day he declared that he had found a ritual worth trying. And they set to work. When the ritual was almost complete, Marcus felt something was wrong. The air filled with sinister energy, and he realized something terrible was happening. At the last moment, he intervened and interrupted the ritual. There was a powerful explosion, turning this place into a trap and Marcus himself into a werewolf. Only then did he realize that Edgar had used him for his purposes, to summon something terrifying into this world. Fortunately, it didn't succeed, but now they were both trapped in this cursed place. Marcus found out that Edgar was a demon seeking power and destruction. Since then, they had been constantly fighting each other, each trying to outwit the other. Now Marcus was worried, seeing us new people coming to this place. He wondered what Edgar had planned this time and what role we played in his schemes. I finished reading this part of the book and felt cold sweat running down my forehead. The werewolf Marcus was desperate and eager to break free from the curse. I looked up and saw my friends Lisa and Tom finishing placing the cubes. The pentagram began to glow, and I realized that we had very little time left. "Stop!" I shouted, but it was too late. The cubes were in place, and the light from the pentagram grew brighter. I knew we had to act quickly, or we would become part of this sinister story forever. The pentagram glowed brighter with each second, and the air filled with whispers and howls, as if invisible spirits had gathered around us. The floor beneath our feet began to vibrate, and we felt an invisible force pulling us toward the center of the ritual. Our hearts pounded with terror and anticipation of the inevitable. The three of us looked at each other, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, ghostly figures of people began to appear around us. Their semi-transparent bodies were mutilated, and their faces expressed torment and suffering. These were the victims of Edgar's experiments, souls trapped in this cursed place. They tried to warn us, their mouths opening, but their words were distorted and unintelligible, as if through a thick veil. We felt their despair and pain, their desire for us to leave this place before it was too late. At that moment, the werewolf burst into the room. His eyes blazed with fury and desperation. He charged toward the center of the pentagram, trying to destroy it, growling loudly. Before we could understand what was happening, Edgar emerged from the shadows. But he was no longer a man. He was a demon. His eyes gleamed with malice, and a sinister smile played on his face. He laughed and mocked our attempts to resist. "Fools," Edgar said, his voice full of malice and contempt. We stood frozen, realizing the depth of the horror we were in. The werewolf, without waiting for our reaction, lunged at Edgar, starting a fierce and brutal fight. Every blow and movement could decide the outcome. We knew we had to help. Tom and I began searching for something that could weaken the demon. We ran to the cubes, which were now floating in the air, and tried to move them, but nothing worked. Lisa was also running around and suddenly screamed that she understood what to do. With trembling hands, she activated an artifact. The pentagram began to fade, and the light grew dimmer. Edgar, realizing he was losing control, roared in rage and rushed at us. "No!" he shouted. "You don't understand what you're doing!" But it was too late. The pentagram started to collapse, and with it the power fueling Edgar began to disappear. He started losing his demonic form, reverting to a human, his face contorted in pain and hatred. "You'll regret this," he whispered, vanishing in a cloud of black smoke. As the pentagram disintegrated, there was a powerful explosion that threw us in different directions. I felt the ground give way beneath me, and everything went dark. I lost consciousness. When I came to, I found myself lying on soft grass. I slowly opened my eyes and saw that I was in the middle of the forest. The sun was shining through the tree canopies, and everything seemed so calm and peaceful. I struggled to my feet, feeling pain all over my body. Looking around, I saw Lisa and Tom, also regaining consciousness nearby. "What happened?" Lisa whispered, her voice trembling with fear and confusion. We looked at each other in fright, trying to understand where we were. Where the sinister house once stood, there was now nothing. The place was overgrown with grass and trees as if it had never existed. The air was filled with the scent of fresh greenery and blooming plants. "This is impossible," Tom said, looking around. "We need to get out of here." We started moving towards where we had left the car. When we reached it, we were horrified. The car was covered in rust. Its windows shattered, and it looked like it hadn't been used in hundreds of years. Grass and shrubs grew around and even through the car, as if nature had reclaimed it. "Something's wrong here," I said, feeling cold sweat run down my back. "We've only been here a few hours, but it looks like a century has passed," added Lisa, her voice shaking. We realized that our sense of time and reality had been distorted. We were terrified, unable to explain what had happened. A feeling of hopelessness and fear grew within us. "We need to walk," Tom said, trying to stay calm. "We have to find a way out of this forest." With those words, we started walking towards the edge of the forest, feeling the persistent fear with every step. The forest, which once seemed ordinary, now appeared sinister and mysterious. The shadows of the trees seemed longer, and the sounds of nature resembled ghostly whispers. We walked, trying to stay together and not fall behind. Time stretched endlessly, and each step was difficult. Thoughts of what had happened haunted us, and each of us silently tried to comprehend what had really occurred. When we finally reached the forest's edge, we saw a world that looked familiar yet alien. We were saved, but what we had experienced left an indelible mark on our hearts. We knew we had to continue living, but the memories of that sinister house and its secrets would haunt us for a long time.